Hello there, this is Will of Willie Media. Now that I've finally settled into my new life here in eastern Iowa, I'm finally ready to get back into my video studio, such as it is. Today's topic is going to be something that's going to come as a shock to anyone who actually knows me personally. This is going to be about why I can't call myself a Star Wars fan anymore. Now, the thumbnail for this video may have implied that Lizzo and Jack Black showing up in the latest Mando episode was the last straw for me, but actually I haven't been watching the latest season of Mando at all. I lost interest quite some time before that. But let me rewind to the very beginning. For most of my life, I've been a huge Star Wars fan. I've been the Star Wars guy in the lives of a lot of people that I've known over the years. Whenever people give me gifts, it's usually some Star Wars related doodad. Mainly, I've always admired anything that had George Lucas's direct involvement, meaning the 6-episode saga and the Clone Wars animated series. Frankly, I believe that George Lucas is a genius, and perhaps the most important artist of our generation, with the Star Wars saga being the most significant artwork created in any of our lifetimes, and it's not even close. That's all 6 films, by the way. I still stand by that claim, and I will justify it another day. Then came the days of Disney, and in the decades since they bought Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise, the brand has descended into what can best be described as an embarrassing disaster. I will list the reasons why in a moment, but I will begin my criticisms, as the best critiques often do, by listing things that have actually gone well for Star Wars in the last 10 years. Firstly, the animated series Star Wars Rebels was for the most part pretty strong, especially for younger audiences. Secondly, Rogue One was an excellent movie in my opinion. I know that there's some debate about exactly how good Rogue One actually was, but it is generally agreed that it was the best project that Disney Lucasfilm has produced. One of my earlier videos was a retrospective on Rogue One. You can check it out here on my channel. Thirdly, the video game Jedi Fallen Order was not only a great game, but a worthy addition to the Star Wars lore, mostly because Lucasfilm didn't create it. Rather, it was made by a creative team that clearly had a lot of respect for the legacy of Star Wars. However, there have been so many shows, movies, and other projects that I can only offer half-hearted praise at best and excoriating rejection at worst. I can't endorse almost any of these projects fully enough to recommend them to a casual viewer, or to even say that they are wholly worthy of the Star Wars name at all. Which brings me to the first reason why I'm not a Star Wars fan anymore. It's the fact that we're living in an age of quantity over quality. Star Wars used to feel like an event. Even back in the Clone Wars days when we were getting new stories on a weekly basis for the first time, it still felt like appointment viewing. I was even in college at the time, and I didn't feel too old to set aside the time every week to catch the new episodes to make sure I wasn't missing anything, even if it was a dud episode. The fact that George Lucas himself was so close to the project lent it an air of authenticity, and there were relevant and important gaps in the saga that were getting filled in. That feeling of relevance just doesn't exist anymore with the new content. Even that word itself bothers me, contents. Just so many of the new stories feel like it's a packaged product made for consumption and disposal, rather than actual meaningful and engaging stories. The second reason I'm not a fan anymore is because I had to bring it up sooner or later, the Sequel Trilogy. I don't want to spend too long on this topic because it's already been done to death, but it's fairly obvious that The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and Rise of Skywalker did a lot of damage to the fandom and to the brand as a whole. Force Awakens showed some promise at the time it came out, but closer scrutiny would have revealed that it didn't really have a good sense of Star Wars' identity or its continuity. The Last Jedi was perhaps the biggest nail in the coffin for reasons I hardly need to explain, and as for Rise of Skywalker, to this day it remains the only theatrical release in the saga that I have not seen, and I never will. I don't need to waste my time with it. My third reason has to do with what I call the Skywalker proximity principle. To summarize, the story that George Lucas set out to tell about how Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader and was redeemed through the actions of his son Luke is by far the most interesting and important story that Star Wars has to tell. It is the crux of the entire galaxy far, far away mythos. Any story that you want to tell in that galaxy should be related to that story in some way or another, whether directly or tangentially. The only exception would be something like Knights of the Old Republic, which is thousands of years removed from the events of that main story. But in competition for significance and relevance, the Old Republic-like story is never going to come close. My point as to why this is a problem for modern Star Wars is that story has already been told, completed, and lastly desecrated by the Sequel Trilogy. There are precious few blanks left to be filled in, and if you ask the question, what happened to Luke and his friends after they saved the galaxy, there are no satisfying answers, nor is there fertile ground for expansion to that story. Reason number 4 is that fans frankly don't know what they want, and Disney doesn't know how to deliver it. The best example I can think of for this disconnect would be one of the most crowd-pleasing moments in recent memory, was the Mandalorian Season 2 finale, where Luke Skywalker returned to kick some butt like a total badass. Many fans have demanded for Luke Skywalker to kick some butt like a total badass ever since The Force Awakens. But here's the problem with that. Luke Skywalker is not that much of a badass. He's a good-hearted guy, a talented pilot, a halfway decent warrior as a Jedi, but a badass? Nah. Darth Vader's hallway scene at the end of Rogue One works because we know how powerful and ruthless he was, but giving Luke the same flavor of hallway scene fighting off a bunch of robots doesn't work nearly as well and feels more like wish fulfillment for the same Gen Xer fans who think the prequel trilogy is bad. Besides, it didn't take long for the Mandalorian storyline to run completely off the rails, so it's not like the return of Luke Skywalker was much of a boon when it was all said and done. I heard that Dave Filoni recently made some controversial comments about Luke Skywalker not quite being the powerful Jedi he's been made out to be, and honestly, I kinda see where he was coming from. Speaking of Dave Filoni, he and Jon Favreau are my 5th and 6th reasons why I'm not a fan anymore. Dave Filoni was directly trained in Star Wars storytelling by George Lucas himself, and Jon Favreau has all the clout and experience you could expect from a top Hollywood filmmaker. You would think that between the two of them, you would have a sufficient replacement for the presence of George Lucas. Unfortunately, the actions of these men have disappointed me bitterly. A large part of the reason for this may very well be the fact that they're under the thumb of Kathleen Kennedy, the current head of Lucasfilm and a persona non grata to anyone who cares about Star Wars. I have no doubt that the Filoni-Favreau duo wants to do the best job they can, but they are either unable to do so, or their best just isn't good enough. The problem with Favreau is that I don't think he ever truly understood George Lucas's creative vision, much like most fans who grew up with the original trilogy. And while it's clear that he has, or had, a vision for what he wants to do with Star Wars, he has been hampered by mismanagement, for which Kathleen Kennedy often gets the blame. For example, the high-profile firing of Gina Carano for voicing opinions that were unpopular in Hollywood but common among the general public. Now, as for Filoni, it really pains me to say this after having so much faith and respect for him for so long, but he has not gotten the results a lot of us have expected. The thing that annoys me about him, more than anything else, is his obvious obsession with Ahsoka Tano. Now, it's fair to say that Ahsoka is a fan-favorite character among the generation who grew up primarily with the Clone Wars, and that's great. But Dave Filoni's direction has hyper-inflated her character. To call her a Mary Sue archetype might be an overstatement a little bit, but it seems like she is a more skilled warrior than nearly anyone else, can do no wrong, can survive anything, and, alright, come to think of it, maybe she is a bit of a Mary Sue archetype at this point. And she still has deeds of galaxy-shaping importance to attend to in her own upcoming spin-off. I don't know about you, but the fact that she is so clearly Filoni's pet character has given me severe Ahsoka fatigue. Now, I already brought her up, but the 8th reason I'm kicking Star Wars to the curb is Kathleen Kennedy, of course. There's little reason to dwell on it for too long, but an unending series of questionable hirings, firings, announcements, and cancellations all lend to a sense that the now infamous KK doesn't know what she's doing and probably never did. Sometimes I wonder if the decision to hire her was George Lucas's last big mistake, or if it was his act of sabotage. Now, I know that lately the rumor mill has been abuzz that her days are numbered, that Bob Iger at Disney is not happy with her, yada yada yada. I want to believe all that, but it's not the first time we've heard all that either. I'll believe it when I see it. just like all those announced projects that got canceled. The ninth reason why I'm not a Star Wars fan anymore is the feeling that it has been homogenized into the morass of modern mainstream entertainment, or the golden age of television, as the brainless consumers of mainstream entertainment are fond of calling it. The golden age of television, which is more of a lead age the way that I see it, is characterized by stories about degenerates and criminals with high production values, method acting performances, and of course, softcore pornography. These stories are often written by nihilists and moral relativists who live in Los Angeles and are more interested in portraying their own warped values than they are with anything aspirational or transcendental. Critical darlings like Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, 13 Reasons, Euphoria, or nearly anything else that you'd find recommended on HBO or Netflix might be well made or well shot or well acted enough to convince you that they are good shows. But compare these best and highest narrative artworks of today to the best and highest narrative artworks from the rest of human history, and I think you would have a hard time finding anything truly good about the stories that people are consuming en masse today. When it comes to Star Wars, nothing feels more like this lead age of television than Andor, which was the first Star Wars series that I actually bailed out on in the middle of and never looked back. Now, I know that there are a lot of Andor fans out there, or Standors as I call them, who claim that Andor is the greatest thing to happen to the Star Wars brand in years, but I found it boring and depressing. Maybe you'll argue that it was part of the point to be boring and depressing. Was it well shot? Sure. Was it well acted? Fine. But did it add anything welcome or positive to my life at all? Not in the slightest, much like everything else about the lead age of television. Andor also featured the first high-profile instances of profanity and implied coitus in the franchise, but if you know the first thing about George Lucas's vision, then you know that this is miles off-brand for Star Wars. To get this list wrapped up into a nice even 10 items, the last reason I'm not a Star Wars fan anymore is the fact that the future is bleak with no enthusiasm. I guess that there are a handful of things on the horizon that look like they could be promising, like the sequel to Jedi Fallen Order, or the Ahsoka spin-off, which looks like it'll be a live-action follow-up to the Rebels series, but there's a few caveats that hamper my expectations here. For one, based on what I've seen in the last few years, and I never even got around to mentioning Kenobi or Boba Fett, I have little trust that an Ahsoka series will be as good as what we want it to be, and as I've already mentioned how I think the importance of Ahsoka Tano has been hyperinflated beyond all reason. Not only that, but that release is only the closest of a whole string of announced projects that I really couldn't begin to care about. A second season of Andor, the Skeleton Crew, the Acolyte, and of course the announced Rey Skywalker movie, which I doubt will see the light of day. Oh yeah, and that Dawn of the Jedi movie with James Mangold. If that's pulled off well, then it could bring my interest back, but again, I just can't trust Lucasfilm to pull together a competent and engaging piece of entertainment anymore that really feels like the big event Star Wars is supposed to be. It will take something radical and unambiguously, uncompromisingly incredible, along with a permanent change in management, for me to feel like I can say I'm a Star Wars fan again. On this day, I have extreme doubts that that day will ever come. Thank you for watching this video, and keep moving north.